Institute. Thank you for joining us. We're live on our YouTube, hopefully on my Twitter, maybe on my Facebook page, maybe on my LinkedIn. We're still learning as we utilize new technology. But again, wanted to bring to a grid conversation to Capitol staffers and members of the legislature. And so we've been promoting this out to offices and members, both in the House and the Senate and the Texas Legislature that's currently in session. That's one of the things that I get asked about constantly as I'm around the Capitol. Policymakers want to know what's going on with the grid. So no better to bring in a couple of people that I've worked with for several years now. Dr. Brent Bennett, the policy director of Life Powered, an initiative, a national initiative of the Texas Public Policy Foundation to raise America's energy IQ. Brent and I worked together for years on grid policies, fighting the discrimination and weaponization of capital against responsible American energy producers, among many other issues, exposing subsidies and so on and so forth. But I wanted to just kind of bring together some experts. I'm waiting on Amy Oliver Cooke. She's an energy fellow at the State Policy Network, and I believe the CEO, founder of Always On Research, another great group of some people that are doing great grid research around the country, probably with the exception of ERCOT, because we're kind of an island of our own. But Brent with the Life Powered Project, the Texas Public Policy Foundation, has just published some great research. Actually, I just noticed on the website 2 research papers, but we're going to talk about the one that I want to talk about is really the cost and reliability in ERCOT. So Brent, what can you tell us about the research that you just published, and what's happening with cost and reliability of electric generation in the ERCOT grid?
Yeah, thanks, Jason. Thanks for setting this all up and helping to get the word out about some of the work that we're doing and some of the information that we want to get out to folks. And I think it's been since your time with us, all the way up until now, it's been one of our kind of missions is to unlock, kind of expose or uncover what are the imposed costs of wind and solar variability in the Texas market, in the ERCOT market. In every system, if you have variability, imposes a cost. And so when you have more variable generation in the system, there's cost that is imposed there. It's kind of like I would say, if you have suppose you had a taxi that only showed up 50% of the time as opposed to a taxi that showed up 100% of the time, right? There's a cost of that because you have to call a second taxi that's more expensive. And that's kind of wind and solar in our system right now. Is they have free fuel, which is great, but they only show up 50% of the time, and then you have to call. If they don't show up, you got to call up a gas power plant to come fill in that gap. And so, what's the difference between that versus a system that it has a car where you're using a taxi or a car that works 100% of the time, right? So it's kind of what we're trying to get at with a lot of the work that we're doing right now. And also, I want to credit the PUC, the Public Utility Commission, for doing a good study at the end of November that talked about the cost of interconnecting wind and solar to the grid, and the cost of ancillary services. Ancillary services being kind of the tools that ERCOT uses to help keep the grid balanced at all times, right? Making sure that the frequency stays stable at 60 hertz, which is what you need to keep the lights on. And that study back in November highlighted that we're, in 2023, we paid, and these costs are all socialized. These go directly to ratepayers. We paid $310 million for wind and solar interconnection and almost $800 million in ancillary services costs for wind and solar. So you combine those also with the ongoing cost of financing transmission lines that we built for wind and solar, which is another $700 million. And you're getting, together with those three pieces, well over $1 billion, about $1.8 billion, $1.8 billion in direct costs. Those are direct pass-through costs, right? So these are all kind of what we call socialized costs, right? And then there's what our latest research covers, which is the cost of wind and solar variability in the energy market. So what is the cost of having to call up, gas power plants to be on demand, right? And that's reflected in the scarcity pricing, which we can, if you want to talk a little more about that, we can, but that's reflected in the scarcity pricing in the system, right? So the fact that prices have to go really high at certain times in order to make sure there's dispatchable generation that comes online. And you have to pay that dispatchable generation a lot for those hours because it's not running all the time, right? And so those units have to make money. If they're only going to run for a few hours, they've got to make a lot of money in those few hours. So it's a very expensive kind of way to operate the system if you have a lot of generation that is only online for a few hours. And so we've calculated that cost in 2023 was nearly $2 billion, about 1.7 billion. So you put, the direct pass-through cost plus the cost of market volatility together was about $3.5 billion in 2023. And so what we think needs to be done is kind of the legislature and the Public Utility Commission need to be systematically starting to make sure that these costs are not socialized to ratepayers, but that wind and solar are paying their share. That's all we're saying. The costs are being paid as it is. It's not like we're adding a new cost by making wind and solar pay for this. We're just saying, look, you need to pay for it instead of the ratepayers, and that needs to be, accounted for in your balance sheet instead of just passed along to ratepayers. So that's kind of the program that we're on right now and the message that we're carrying to the legislature.
That's great. And I know earlier this week, there was some people that were talking in front of the Energy Resources Committee about all of the investments that have been is put on wind, solar, and batteries. But and you've done some research on this. Talk a little bit about investments and kind of and I've talked about in other states this misallocation of resources. Can you just shed a little light on some of the investments, because they make it sound really rosy when they're spending billions of dollars, almost like the EPA with some of their grants that they've been giving out, and finding out that just today reported $20 billion to 5 nonprofits that had gotten started months before they were given billions of dollars. So talk about some of the resources and investments, because again, it does sound rosy when you say we're investing billions of dollars in Texas. Go ahead, please expand on that if you would.
Yeah, well, as you and I always say, the reason that all of the above energy policy is dumb is because every dollar that you spend on something that's not optimal is a dollar you could be spending on something that's optimal. And so it's really, there's really, you want to, all the above just means you subsidies for everything. That's basically, and that's how the Inflation Reduction Act was justified, right? So if you count in over the last 20 or so years in Texas, and this is straight from the American Clean Power Association, they're the big lobbying group for wind and solar. They calculated that over $130 billion of private investment has gone into wind and solar in Texas, 130 billion, and that's on top of probably 20 to 30 billion in federal subsidies, federal and state subsidies. So if you think about it, that's a lot of investment going to one side of the market. If we just invested 25 billion of that in weather resiliency, reliability measures, dispatchable generation, Winter Storm Uri would not have been a problem. All the states around us, largely managed Winter Storm Uri fine. We had some rolling outages to the north, but mainly because they couldn't get enough gas from Texas because we were using all the gas. They were relying on us for imports. So the other grids around us did fine. Why was this such a disaster for us? It's because we're allocating so much capital to one set of resources that don't work during winter storms very well. And so it's not that we need to stop allocating all of our capital to those resources, although there's an argument for that too. That's not necessarily that. It's just that we need to make sure that there's some of that money is being applied to what's really needed to keep the lights on. And to ensure that those kinds of disasters don't happen, because otherwise it's just going to be, again, the ratepayers will have to pay for this. And that's kind of what what we've done up to this point is we just said, well, all the securing more fuel supply, the dispatchable generators have to weatherize, all these costs just are reflected in higher operating costs for those units that are passed on to ratepayers. And wind and solar have gotten off without having to pay anything for that. So we feel like that it's being discriminatory to ratepayers right now, the way our system is set up to socialize all these costs.
I was just reading something this morning from Reliable Energy, a group in Indiana, talking about a company there that had decommissioned, early retired a coal-fired power plant and had planned to convert it to natural gas, but have paused that conversion. And they early retired this coal-fired power plant well before the cost had been recouped. And so now they're passing on, I want to say it's north of $300 million in cost for that plant they're passing that on to ratepayers. And I think the analogy that was used in this email was it's like paying a mortgage for a home that you can't live in. And it's like you get 30-year mortgage, but you're only going to live in it for 15 years. But guess what? You still have to pay for it for the next 15 years until you pay off that mortgage. And then there's even cost after that. But it seems to be that maybe there's some energy reality hitting other states as well, which is unfortunate. But you're right. The costs do get passed on to ratepayers. And it seems like what's being done is certainly not energy dominance right now. And it's, here we are in this declared energy emergency. We need more affordable and reliable energy. I'm optimistic at the federal level that we may see a course correction, especially with, our good friend Chris Wright as the Secretary of Energy. He's been a great partner of ours over the last few years. And really, I think he's going to be just one of the best advocates for affordable and reliable. Not all of the above, because as you alluded to, all of the above includes heavily subsidized Chinese dependent made components that don't reduce the cost of energy. Affordable and reliable means it works and that people can afford it. And I think that's what the direction that we need to be going in. So sorry, I kind of digressed there, but let's talk a little bit about the makeup of our generation that we have right now in the ERCOT grid. What are we looking at? I remember during Winter Storm Uri that it was about 67% of our generation was thermal sources from natural gas, from coal, and from nuclear. And about 33% was from the weather dependent variable sources of generation. Where are we now in the ERCOT grid?
I think there's three kind of key metrics that you look at. One is the installed capacity of the resources, which is the maximum that they can produce. Oh, there's Amy.
Hey, Amy, sorry for the technical difficulties. I'm glad you persisted and got in. Welcome. Brent, go ahead with your question. And Amy, I'll pitch to you and we'll talk about what some other states are doing for affordable and reliable energy. But I know you're on the same table with us.
100%. I've enjoyed the conversation.
Okay, good. Well, I'm glad you've been able to hear, and I apologize for the technical difficulties. Welcome in, Amy.
All right. No, so there's three metrics really that you look at. As one is the installed capacity, which is the maximum production that is possible, and that's the numbers that you cited. We're actually up, nearing 50% of our grid of installed capacity is wind and solar. I think we'll reach that point by next year, and so we're getting pretty close to it already. So that's the installed capacity. Then there's the average production, which is the annual, the average annual production. Wind and solar last year, 33% of the average annual production came from wind and solar. We'll probably get closer to 40% this year.
Incredible. So that's an annualized generation, and media loves to talk about this. They love look at how much electricity we're getting from this, again, free fuel source that costs billions of dollars and millions of miles of transmission lines, but I digress. But they love to talk about that. And my response is, what are they doing during peak demand times?
And so that's the third metric that's really key is what is the production during peak times, and what is what we call the maximum. Yeah, here's Jason's got a diagram from the paper.
Yeah, this is from your paper showing what the generation looks like during winter. So go ahead.
Yeah, so these are the peak hours during the winter. The key is that really what you want to think about is what is the demand minus wind minus solar output, and that determines how much dispatchable generation that you need. So we call that net load or net demand. That's really the key metric that determines how much dispatchable generation you need. So what this shows here is that especially during the winter times, peak demand occurs at 8 a.m. and 8 p.m. when there's almost no sun. There's no sun at 8 p.m. and very little at 8 a.m. So that's why solar has produced almost nothing during those hours. And wind production also is pretty scarce because during these times of highest grid stress is typically when you don't have a lot of wind, right? And there's also a lot of variability around the wind too there compared to what you see with our dispatchable fleet, which again, dispatchable by definition, you're you're dispatching with demand. So when you need it the most, it's there, and it's also not that variable, right? So there's a very low variability there with the thermal fleet up in the top left corner. And that's really like, and so this is, again, this is what when I talk about imposed costs, there's an imposed cost to relying on resources that, produce in the way that solar and wind do versus thermal resources. And how are we accounting for that in our market? The problem is that, our market is wholly reliant on, 15-minute energy prices for paying units, which works fine if all your units are those ones up in the top left are your thermal units. Then you're just saying, well, all the units behave pretty similarly during times of scarcity. They bring the same capacity value. So all we're looking for is the lowest operating cost. Whatever units have lowest operating costs, those are the ones that get used. And that's great normally. But if the units that have the lowest operating cost because the fuel is free and they're subsidized, wind and solar, don't bring the same attributes and capacity value as your thermal fleet, well, then you're stuck with what we have. We have, a system that fuels $130 billion into those resources because they have low operating costs, but doesn't pay enough for reliability.
Sure.
And that's and so this is a microcosm. This diagram is kind of a microcosm of the investment problem, both the investment problem and the physical problem that we're facing here in ERCOT.
Yeah, so it's like, and I use the term misallocation of resources. We're putting the market, and I say we, but it's really the way the market is designed. We're putting more money in the solar and wind and batteries than we are into thermal generation. Is that accurate?
Oh yeah, by 10, 20 times.
I also
and all the money that we are putting into, I should say that we're not, that's in terms of capital investment, right? I mean, there is the revenue in the market. There's still the revenue market is there's still a large portion of it going to dispatchable because they're the units that are producing when prices are highest, when we need them the most, right?
Yeah.
Wind and solar are getting by on not that much revenue because they get a lot of production tax credit or investment tax credit subsidies, and their fuel costs are free, so they don't need a whole lot of revenue in this market. But the problem is that that's what we're building the most of, and we're not building enough of the things that are needed for reliability.
Even with the Texas Energy Fund that was created last session, to $5 billion of low interest rate loans, even with some accelerators for completion of building new thermal generation, we're still seeing this misallocation, resources going into these things that in winter, when it really matters most, and I quote Bjorn Lomborg often, he says that wintertime is much more dangerous because colder temperatures, as we found out during Winter Storm Uri, are much more dangerous than heat. It's to the tune of like 20 to 40 times more people will lose their lives in colder temperatures than they will in heat temperatures. So that's unfortunate. But
yeah, and by relying more and more on solar, we are increasing the winter risk because we know solar won't produce during peak times in the winter, especially during big storms like Uri, and we're basically we're now have our system shifted to where those are we don't have as much dispatchable generation to cover those times now. So it's the net demand is highest now in the winter. We just set a new record a couple weeks ago, actually, when it got really cold. So so actually by relying on solar, we're making that winter problem worse than it was before.
Yeah, and I've already seen that those demands show up in my electricity bill, and that will happen with others as well, as their electricity bills from last month start to come in, and the costs were much higher than the month prior and even the year prior. So that's unfortunate. Just got to notice that my electricity rates will be raised over 4.5% to 5% from my co-op. They're passing these costs on to consumers, which is really unfortunate. But last comment that I have on this chart from your paper that people can find at Life Powered, LIFE powered.org, lifepowered.org. This paper is there in this screenshot. I like to look at this like this. If you're going to hire someone to do a job, you want thermal, you're going to hire thermal pretty much every time because they're going to show up over 90% of the time during your busiest hours, during your peak demand. My experience in high school and college working at restaurants, we knew Friday nights, Saturday nights, holidays like St. Patrick's Day that's coming up, we were going to be slammed. And so you brought in more people. You brought in the people that you know were going to show up, that weren't going to call in sick because they wanted to go party. But then, like, look at solar. Solar might show up 4 to 5% of the time during winter, really peak demand times, and wind's going to show up 15% of the time. But you're still paying for them, and you're paying millions of dollars for transmission lines that are getting passed on to consumers. Thermal's actually built near where the demand is, so you don't need as many transmission lines. I mean, you see thermal generation just in East Austin. You can go a little further east out to Fayette. There's a coal-fired power plant. Those are close to where the population centers are, and safely getting us electricity. So, Amy, what are we seeing around the country in this regards of, affordable and reliable electricity? I know you do a lot of work with the State Policy Network. Will you tell our listeners that may not be familiar with what the State Policy Network is?
Yeah, we are a group of state-based think tanks. It's SPN, State Policy Network, is sort of the umbrella organization for groups like Texas Public Policy Foundation. In all 50 states, some states even have multiple think tanks, but most have at least one. So I think there are up to 57, 60 some odd think tanks. Affiliated with the State Policy Network. The other thing I do is I co-founded an energy analytics and research firm called Always On Energy Research. And one of the other reasons why I kind of know a little bit about what's going on in other states is we have modeled state energy policies. We've modeled utility IRPs. We've modeled, when I say modeled, we model for cost and reliability. So much of what Brent is talking about the investment that we're forced to make into intermittent weather dependent resources. I mean, that's capital that is invested, that could be invested in a thermal resource that's going to be there 24/7. We're investing in a resource that might be there 10% of the time, 15% on a good day, maybe 30%, 35%. And so what that cost is, and then after you've made all of those costs, you've invested all of that money, are you actually getting the power you need? And what we have found in multiple states is that they're investing heavily in weather dependent resources because the incentives are there to do so, right, at the federal level. Which of course the incentives are wrong, but the incentives are there. So they're investing heavily, utilities, and of course that gets passed on to ratepayers, are investing heavily in wind and solar, and then backup, because you've got to have backup, or a peaker plant, which, as Brent mentioned, single most, what a ridiculous way to power a system, right? Like, you're going to take your most reliable asset and only use it at variable times. And you're going to power it up and power it down and power it up. I mean, I don't know who thought of this all, but it's Kafkaesque. Anyway, so they're spending in some cases, in some states, hundreds of billions of dollars. Colorado is a prime example of what not to do, which is go 100% wind and solar, look at a $600 billion price tag, and then at the same time have a look at possibly 24, 36 hours of being without power, because based on weather patterns, you won't have enough wind, solar, and backup to even power it. And here's a prime example, and this is one of my favorites. And I'll talk about this real quick, about sort of what's happening in the states and then what some states are doing. But North Carolina. So I spent about 5 years in North Carolina, and you all in Texas had Winter Storm Uri in 2021. Well, that area of sort of the Southeast, actually kind of MISO, PJM, there was Winter Storm Elliott. North Carolina is a vertically integrated state, meaning not part of an RTO, just a very small portion of the northeastern quadrant of North Carolina is part of PJM. Most of it is vertically integrated state, and Duke Energy is the utility. If you're going to work with utility, and I will say this, Duke is a relatively honest broker in the game. I mean, they're good folks at Duke. So I have nothing against Duke. But what happened was, it was Christmas Eve 2022, and Duke Energy, there were predictions on temperature. It ended up being much colder than anticipated. lines froze up, right? Or and some plants are down for maintenance, and then purchased power didn't materialize. So what do you have? You have a demand is higher than you expected because it's gotten much colder, and your supply has dropped. You guys know what happens when that occurs. There are rolling blackouts. Now, the thing about that particular situation, it was about 14 hours of rolling blackouts in North Carolina that on Christmas Eve, and of course everybody was upset because dinner's in the oven, and I mean you get it. So about 10 days later, the NCUC, the North Carolina Utilities Commission, drags Duke in front of them and says, you better tell us exactly what happened and exactly how you're going to fix it. And so I listened to the entire testimony, and they went through minute by minute exactly what happened and what they were going to do to fix it. But here was the thing, because North Carolina has a significant amount of installed solar capacity. But this happened in the overnight hours. And this is what they said. Solar performed as expected.
We heard that in Texas a lot too.
Which means it didn't show. And so what I loved was you had these champions for solar saying, see, it performed exactly as expected. It did exactly what it's supposed to do. Therefore, double down on investment in it. We're like, wait a second. It did exactly what it was supposed to do, which means it didn't show. You know what showed up? Coal, nuclear, and then the natural gas that where there wasn't maintenance going on or line hadn't frozen. So your reliable resources show up at the most important times. So the question becomes, why do we throw good capital after things, to the point that Brent made and Chris Wright made during his conversation, was why would you pay for a cab that you're not sure it's going to even show up? And then because it isn't going to show up, you're not sure. Not only are you, you can't just wait for the cab to not show to get your backup. You actually have to schedule a backup ahead of time. It is, but we're seeing in state after state, there are some states that are doing it right. Utah is looking at, Utah is not going to be caught in the same situation. They have learned from what happened to Texas. They're like, we're not going there. They've also looked at some other states. The Northeast is in a very, very bad way as well. But New Hampshire is doing some things to try and stave off some of the worst of it because they're part of an ISO. So they're looking at some language and some public policy, some bills at the state legislature to stave off the worst of what's happening in ISO New England. Colorado has essentially just given a blank check to the utilities saying, here, build whatever you need, charge it to ratepayers, it'll be fine. And Colorado is steering at something like between transmission and distribution, something like $81 billion. And that is before they've built another generating plant. And so we keep advising people, stop shutting down reliable assets or coal, especially, meaning mostly coal. Like, don't do it until you know what the actual load is going to be. Why would you retire prematurely an asset that is perfectly good when you believe your load is going to double in the next 5 to 10 years? I mean, it's nuts, but some states are doing it right. And we look at Utah, Arizona is trying to get it right. There are some folks in Arkansas trying to get it right. I mean, like, they've looked at what has happened to other states, and we don't want to go there.
That's great. Yeah, I know in the Northeast, because we've got to learn from other people's mistakes. The Northeast is doing what the Germany's doing and the United Kingdom are doing. They're embracing this energy transition, which is a political agenda, by the way. It does nothing to mitigate a changing climate, just makes everything more expensive. They are, and they have some of the highest electricity costs in the world. Germany has the highest. They battle the United Kingdom, California, and the Northeast United States having the highest electricity costs in the world. It's driving industry away from their states, away from their countries. Like Germany, BASF, one of the world's largest chemical producers that makes things like fertilizer. they're shutting down operations and moving those over to China, and they're citing high energy costs is the reason. This is a German company. Other German companies, automobile manufacturing companies, headquartered based in Germany. Over half the automobile manufacturing is offline. They're standing by right now. They don't have the demand because their ports are flooded with Chinese EVs, but also the electricity costs are too high. Electricity costs or energy and labor are your two highest drivers in business, especially in manufacturing. And when one of them is astronomically high, you're going to drive it to places where they'll find it for cheaper. And that's what they're doing. They're moving operations to China, or they're just shutting down. And it's incredibly detrimental to human flourishing. So you mentioned Utah. Amy, what are they doing in Utah to really kind of push back and go in the right direction?
So Utah is one of those states that has taken. I'm not particularly fond of this of this language, but they're taking what I would a holistic approach, but others would call it a whole of government approach. But they have prioritized reliability and affordability. They have no intention of having what happened, for instance, with Winter Storm Uri or Winter Storm Elliott happened in their state. So, number one, they are prioritizing reliability and affordability. And that's actually key because when you look at it, I mean, and there are a whole number of ways that you can do that. You can do it through your incentives are, or you're essentially telling your PUC, listen, when somebody wants to build a new asset, your base load, you have to do base load for base load. So if it's a base load asset, and that's another thing they do, you can't go and replace it with a bunch of intermittent assets. So it's a base load for base load transfer. Arizona is doing the exact same thing through their utilities commission as well. North Carolina put into statute that reliability and least cost are priorities. And then, since then, those of us who worked on that are tightening up that language a little bit. But I will say this about Utah. To me, Utah has looked at a number of states and has sort of doubled down on it. And they have principles. Here's the other thing: they have this sort of principled approach. Which is going to make any kind of unraveling of this much more difficult because it's all in statute. And in statute, they list their priorities: adequacy, dispatchability, reliability, affordability. Unraveling that or trying to roll that back in order to favor sort of weather dependent resources is going to be very, very difficult. So I applaud them for not only just getting, what their energy office is doing and what the legislature is doing, but also getting it into statute, and that stakeholders have to agree to those priorities to be part of the conversation. Like, you have to agree that Utah's generating portfolio must meet adequacy. It must be reliable.
That's
It
great.
must be dispatchable. That's how you get invited to the table. And if you're not if you don't agree to that, then you are obviously agreeing to a poorer Utah. And Utah uses that as economic development. And like in Colorado, they're like, well, what can we do? I said, well, if I'm on the western slope of Colorado, I'd throw an extension cord over to Utah and see if they'd be willing to sell me some power, because theirs will always be on while Colorado's will eventually go dark. But that's why data centers want to go to places like Utah. It's why they want to go to states where the cost is low and they prioritize reliability because they need the power. People think that if they incentivize like property tax reductions for these data centers or something, that's what's going to lure them to their state. But, having talked to a number of developers, and I know you guys have as well, what they want is speed to power, and they want their power reliable. They need it 24/7. It's not like they all want to participate in some kind of demand response program the way, say, Bitcoin can, but most of them need power all the time. So hats off to Utah. And actually, I can send you. They have an entire framework that they've put together. I'm happy to share it with you, Jason, if you guys want to send it out.
That's great. Thanks, Amy. Appreciate it. I know the first time I saw a satellite picture of Haiti and the Dominican Republic was Chris Wright was giving a presentation in Denver in 2018. Now our Secretary of Energy, his former company, Liberty Energy, a member of the trade organization that I represent, the American Energy Institute, that advocate for policies that would actually reduce the cost of energy. But I joked that Colorado and Utah are going to be like Haiti and the Dominican Republic. One of them is going to have trees because they have affordable and reliable, dense energy, and one of them won't because they don't. And that's what happens. Leads to
That's exactly right. That is, I tell people in my state, I'm in Colorado, I tell them all the time, they're like, what can we do? Get a generator and vote differently. I don't know. I mean, these are your options.
Yeah. Brent, what are some policy recommendations? I know you and I have been working on one since before Winter Storm Uri to help really with the reliability and the affordability efforts within ERCOT. What are some of those recommendations to ensure that we have that here in Texas that we desperately need?
Yeah, and before I answer that question directly, I'll just piggyback off of what Amy said and make 2 points. One of which is that regardless of what the federal government does, the states ultimately have sovereignty and authority over their electric systems. And so what states do matters. The federal government can subsidize wind and solar out the hilt, but we still have the ability to control what happens within our state borders. That's particularly true of ERCOT because we're not under the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission. So we created this problem by designing a market that did not properly value reliability. And we also have the ability to fix it. I would say the other thing too is that, Amy and her colleagues are promoting a really good idea, which is the kind of only get what you pay for. And I think that's the key. Going back, Jason, to your original, to your statement about, not paying for workers that don't show up. I would just say, pay a lower. What we really need to do is we pay those guys what they're worth. We pay the guys that show up, all the time. We pay them what they're worth, and we don't overpay the guys that don't show up. The problem is in markets outside of Texas, the utilities get to assess the full capital cost of their projects to ratepayers, regardless of what the resource is. So what Amy and her colleagues have been pushing in other states is, well, they only get to assess the firm value of their capacity. So whatever the accredited capacity is of wind and solar, whatever they consider the the RTO or the governing entity considers to be firm, that's how much they get to rate base. They don't get to rate base anything else. They don't get to pass that cost on to consumers. They have to absorb the risk of building that and not ratepayers. The same principle has to apply here in Texas. Now, the difference in Texas is that we don't have a monopoly utility that is rate basing capital costs. We have a competitive market where you're funded through energy payments. So what does that look like? What does only get what you pay for look like in Texas? And it's, as I kind of said in the beginning, we have to basically reduce the revenue that goes to unreliable resources and increase the revenue that goes to reliable resources according to how unreliable or reliable they are. Right now, our energy market pays the same price regardless of your ability to produce in the future, right? You get the same price for energy, regardless of whether you can guarantee that the next time or not. And so we have to start working on those imposed, getting that kind of that differential fix. And so what you do is you do what we have an existing law, which was passed 2 years ago in House Bill 1500, was a reliability requirement for new generators. But all these costs that I talked about at the beginning of the call, $3.5 billion in imposed costs, half of which is in energy costs, that's in the existing system. So new generators, just doing this for new generators is not going to work for a long time. What we need to have a reliability standard for the whole grid. And to pay generators according to whether they meet or exceed that standard. They need to be incentivized if they exceed it. If they fall below it, they need to pay in to do that. And that'll help provide some balance to the energy price that we have now. So we'll still pay for energy, but we'll also have some payment for reliability. And it's not just about, the ideas that have been floated, like the performance credit mechanism, are just trying to pay more for reliability. But again, that's just ratepayers paying more. It's not, that's not, you need both. You need to pay more for reliability, but you also need to have the resources that are not reliable pay more. Because otherwise you're still going to be overpaying those resources, and we got to stop doing that. We should only pay resources what they're worth to the system. And so that's, I think, even though our market is very different from all the other states, that the commonality is that we ratepayers should only be paying for what we actually get from our resources and not more. And right now, all of our systems are set up to overpay wind and solar for what they're actually worth. And so we got to fix that and right size that. And if we do, okay, fine. The federal government wants to subsidize them 100%. Fine. They're only going to get paid what they're worth, and reliable generators are going to get paid what they're worth, and that will fix our markets.
So it's good timing, because what we had in the chat was a question, without subsidies, what market reforms are needed in ERCOT? And you talked about we're paying those costs. It just increases the cost, and we're doing that now. I think that your paper that you had shows millions or maybe millions of dollars that ratepayers are picking up on the tab, because ERCOT is essentially having equipment standby in case the wind doesn't blow or the sun doesn't shine, or the batteries, which you as a battery scientist is what I called you. I know you've worked in that sphere before. You have your experience in that area. You've given presentations all over the country, if not the world, on that particular topic about utility scale batteries, and done a lot of research for me when I would ask you how much installed battery capacity there was around the world and how long it would keep the lights on. And it was minutes, not hours or days, and storms last days. But you talked about in the paper a lot of the costs being pushed along. So I think your response goes along again to the question that we got in the chat: without subsidies, what market reforms are needed in ERCOT?
Yeah, it's the reliability requirement and making sure that penalties and incentives are assessed according to that. And that's what, Senate Bill 715, which is in the legislature right now, that's what that will accomplish. So it's going to take a lot of work to get the parameters right, but we think that that's really the solution that we need here. Just as in other states, the solution is to make sure that you're only paying for what you get. You only pay utilities what you get for your wind and solar resources. So I think that's really the critical piece. And we hope we're pushing really hard at the federal level to get rid of the subsidies, because that will certainly help. But even regardless of whether that happens, we at the state level need to get our markets right, and deal with both the existing wind and solar resources that we have that we're overpaying, and also the ones that may or may not come if we get rid of the subsidies.
Jason, can I weigh in on two things on this? First, Brent, thank you for bringing the fact that states are 100% responsible for their generating portfolio. They get to decide. Despite the federal incentives, they get to decide. So they own their bad decisions. So, and that's one thing, when your state legislator says the EPA is making us do this, states may own their bad decisions. And they own their good decisions. So if you're in a state where your legislature is doing the right thing, you should thank them because they're making courageous decisions. Only pay is one of those where, yeah, you pay for the resources that show up, and you pay less for the ones that don't. I mean, I loved your analogy about the worker, and there are a couple of states that have either drafted language on it or have introduced that. The other one I would throw out there is consumer regulated electricity, which is where large end users who need power quickly, they can, you allow them to build their own. And New Hampshire has introduced consumer regulated electricity, and they're in an ISO. And as we've recommended, listen, if you're New Hampshire, just get the heck out. You should not, don't let the others, bad decisions from the other states pull you down. But they have introduced, and it's bipartisan, 11 sponsors, but I think New Hampshire is one of those states that has a whole bunch of lawmakers. But they've introduced consumer regulated electricity, which is large end users get out from underneath sort of a regulatory scheme. I mean, they have to follow, obviously, contract law and everything else and environmental policy. They can build and own their own. And you could certainly partner with a utility to build and transmit your own power. For an example of that is like what Fervo and Google did in Nevada, and they worked with Nevada Power and Light on it. But Fervo provided the product, Google paid for it, and they worked with Nevada Power on getting that dispatched back to Google's data center. So consumer regulated electricity is another option. And then we keep telling, stop shutting down good assets. I mean, like, would you dump your car just because it's got 100,000 miles on it and you say, yeah, I'm going to go buy a DeLorean instead? I mean, it's silly, and the economics don't make sense. So
yeah, I like this idea of consumer regulated electricity. I've talked to a couple of policymakers about it and visiting with some offices this week in the Capitol. I have no affiliation with anybody that's pushing it, but it's just another good idea that would help meet demand growth that we have for data centers, for probably oil and gas exploration. I kind of call it like these free trade zones. You see a lot of those pop up around ports, but hey, let's create a free trade zone for electric generation. You're not connected to the grid. You can sell electricity to your customers within that free trade zone. And it really could help meet some demand for some of the growing AI needs, data centers. And there's so much for that. Unfortunately, a lot of those look for like, hey, we want to bring electricity and for the data center, but then we want to sell excess back to the grid. Well, that costs money to do that, and it competes with existing generation. It really just more distortions on the market. Brent, let's jump back into Senate Bill 715 by Senator Sparks that you talked about. This really puts a reliability standard that's in law now for new generation built after January 1st, 2021. So new
2027.
I'm sorry, thank you for the correction. 2027, new generation. So it won't apply to any of the grid that's built today, and 50% of the variable sources if we continue down the path. 715 removes that date and basically says that's the date that all generation. So it's not saying wind and solar or variable sources of generation have to meet a reliability standard. It's saying all generation has to meet a reliability standard, and the PUC has to implement that by January 1st, 2027. Is that correct?
Yes. And again, the key is that we need both. There's the 50% of the grid that's going to be wind and solar by the end of next year. That needs to be, they have to be part of this. We're incurring costs already because of that. There's severe market distortion happening because of overpaying those generators. We have to fix that problem, and it's costing us a couple $2 billion a year. So if we can't ignore that. And also we can't ignore the fact that the existing reliable generation that we need is not being paid enough. And so what Amy said about, not prematurely retiring assets. Well, that has happened already in Texas, and it will happen more. A lot of companies have held off since Uri because, and in 2023, because they did get a lot of money from that, and they're also seeing, demand going up, and they're like, well, we better wait to retire stuff. But if we keep underpaying those resources, they will be prematurely retired. And so we have to ensure that doesn't happen either. So it's really important that if this policy is going to have any impact, that we have to apply it to the whole grid, and also that it also will make sure that we're not adding further distortions by having two standards, one for one set of generators that are built after a certain point, and a different one for existing generators. So so I think that and I think that we can design this policy in a way that ensures that we are maintaining enough generation. I think that's a concern of people, that we're going to lose existing generation if there's a standard imposed on them. And I would say that, first of all, dispatchable generation should not be concerned about a reliability standard, because that's, those units should be meeting the standard by default. And if wind and solar want to firm up, then they have the option to. They can purchase power, backup power. They can do the things to reduce their variability. And frankly, for resource adequacy purposes, we can lose 10 gigawatts of wind and 10 gigawatts of solar tomorrow, and it would make almost no difference on our ability to meet demand, especially during those winter hours when you don't get any sun anyways. And usually, the most crucial times, there's not a lot of wind either. Frankly, we can afford to lose some of those resources. It's not something that people should be worried about. I think, we've done all the modeling to show that's okay. So I wouldn't expect that we would, because those resources are mostly in the money as it is. But what I would hope is that by implementing this policy, both we achieve lower costs for ratepayers with our existing resources, but also create more balance in the resource mix going forward. I think one thing we haven't mentioned is that we're moving the resource mix going forward is almost entirely solar and energy storage. There's actually very little wind because they need more transmission lines to get built to build more wind, but it's almost all solar and batteries, and then a little bit of generation that we're financing through the Texas Energy Fund. And that's
hundreds of times more expensive, and completely dependent, well over 90% on Chinese components, where they don't care about the human rights or the environmental protections of people that are building those components. It's just staggering to me how much more expensive electricity is from batteries, and how we're
So
Senator Birdwell's got a bill to kind of strike some renewable energy subsidies, which TPPF, I think, just shared some polling with me, your company, the Texas Public Policy Foundation, shows that over 72% of people in Texas think that wind and solar should be held and be reliable, be available to produce electricity when we need it, not just when the weather's cooperating. And that's really what firming does. It says we need to be able to count on you when it gets really cold or when it gets really hot, when demand gets high, to help keep the cost down. And so,
and if you don't do that, then you need to be paid less. You
almost
only pay for what you get.
There you go. And then another thing I was surprised about is over 55% of the people out there in Texas that were polled show that they're still concerned about the reliability of the grid, which I don't think they should be as concerned with the reliability, but the affordability is the big thing, because we're paying a lot more for what we're getting and what we're not getting. But
I think what drives that concern, rightly so, is that all people see is that solar and batteries are getting built. And that's what's in the interconnection queue. So I think there's a sense, people are assessing that there's a sense of like, wow, this isn't going to, we have all this demand growth coming from data centers. This isn't going to meet that. Something's got to give here. So I think there's a sense of that. And if we can, I think the goal was, if we'll know that our policies are working if we get a more balanced resource mix coming into the system. I think that's really what and we also will know it's working when we don't see our costs go up like California's have, because that's what's California doing? They're building all solar and batteries, and we're doing the exact same thing. So we haven't gotten there yet to where they are, but we're heading that direction.
Amy, any closing thoughts? I know we've got a hard stop here at 1:00 Central Time. Any closing thoughts or recommendations, Amy?
Well, a couple of things. One thing that I mean, something that Brent said is really staggering. You could think about that, 10,000 megawatts of wind and 10,000 megawatts of solar, and you'd still be able to power the state. I mean,
it blew my mind. I heard that too. I wrote it down. I was like, oh my God.
I did too. Like, I'm sitting here going, because I got to, in North Carolina, for instance, if you lost 10,000 megawatts of nuclear, you would lose a third of your generating portfolio that is on 24/7. That when you look at, for those of us who actually look at, look at EIAs, how the generating, I love real-time generation. I love to see what's generating when, and nuclear is like this.
Yeah, it's just a great baseload, stable, constant.
It is a workhorse. It is always there, always on. So when you so when you say you could take 10,000 megawatts of wind and solar offline and probably not feel it, and you've paid for it. I mean, that's astounding. Real quick, I will say this in closing thoughts. I'll wrap up so that you guys can finish up. But first of all, I want to thank you for having me. And it's refreshing to talk to you guys and talk folks in Texas, because you put people first, right? The people of the state of Texas matter. the most. So therefore, we have to deliver power to them reliably and affordably. Same thing I get in Utah, same thing I get in other states. I say that as somebody who's sort of held hostage by bad energy policy in Colorado, which doesn't put people first, where we've seen rates go up 40% over 15 years. And by the way, reliability has gone down, and we are looking at skyrocketing rates in the future. So really appreciate what you guys are doing. You're Texas, for crying out loud. Everybody looks to see what you guys are doing. So we know when you get it right, we can look at it and get it right in other states. And then for your lawmakers, consider consumer regulated electricity like you. I'm not affiliated with them. I know the guys, but it's not like I'm part of the team or anything. And only pay, and then keep your coal assets online. You guys will be good.
Yeah, great. Brent, any closing thoughts?
No, just again, we've got ourselves into this mess by the decisions we made in the past, but we still have a chance to get ourselves out. And every year that we wait and delay and hem and haw is a year of increasing costs and increasing risk. So I think it's just incumbent upon us to take this opportunity and act now and start to fix this problem. And then if we do, then I think that the sooner we can get back to having an affordable and reliable grid.
Great. Well, thank you so much. I appreciate everybody jumping in. I'm going to go ahead and end the live stream now here. Thanks for being there. Staff, if you have any questions for us, you know where you can find me and Brent. And if y'all will just hang on 1 second, it's grabbing the recordings now.